During World War I, fighter pilots were a new type of warrior, and they became national heroes. The same occurred in World War II, and, like their predecessors, a few became legendary. One was a German, Luftwaffe Captain Hans-Joachim Marseille, known as the Star of Africa. Who was Hans-Joachim Marseille? What made him stand out as perhaps the best fighter pilot of the war, if not of all time? Why was he so controversial? Why did his enemies admire him as much as the Germans?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, military veteran, historian, author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Hans-Joachim Marseille was born on December 19, 1919, in Charlottenburg, Berlin, Germany. He was a brilliant student, although lazy academically, and a good athlete despite having contracted Spanish influenza as an infant. His father was a World War I pilot, Siegfried Marseille, who had an affair and divorced his mother and married another woman, leaving Hans and his sister, Inge. This was always an issue with the young boy. Marseille had a deep sense of right and wrong and was often in trouble standing up for his Jewish friends in school until all Jews were expelled. Always in fights, stealing a motorcycle, and being labeled as a swing kid in 1930s Germany branded him a juvenile delinquent. Marseille's father convinced him to join the Luftwaffe as he saw a war coming. Hoping to keep his son out of the infantry, he had Marseille enlist, and he took the exams, entered basic flight school, attending, and was almost thrown out for being drunk, womanizing, and violating curfews. Two of his comrades through basic flight school in Fürstenfeldbruck and then advanced fighter pilot school at Schwekat near Vienna were future aces Kurt Bühligen and Werner Schroer, the latter serving with Marseille in North Africa, flying many missions with him. Since arriving at flight school on November 1st, 1939, his fitness reports regarding his discipline had followed him and were less than stellar. And Marseille's shaky start in flight school due to his lack of military bearing and discipline was offset by his graduating with perfect scores in aerobatics and gunnery. His romantic escapades became legendary, often being the reason that he was in trouble so often and restricted to barracks. He immediately ran afoul of Fighter Pilot School No. 5's Commandant, Colonel, later Major General, Eduard Ritter von Schleich, the famed Black Baron, who had 32 victories in World War I, and the Pour le Mérite, or the famed Blue Max. Men were thrown out of the school for even the slightest infraction, but it was believed that von Schleich's friendship with Marseille's father since World War I may have had an influence in his not being dismissed despite many violations. Marseille graduated top of his class on June 18, 1940. Marseille and Schroer were both assigned to their first unit at Mersburg as cover for the Luna chemical complex, but Marseille's ability to arouse the ire of his fellow pilots, not to mention his superiors, saw him transferred to the 1st Group Legergeschwader II in Leeuwarden, Holland, under the command of Spanish Civil War veteran, 1st Lieutenant, later Colonel Herbert Ihlefeld. Marseille managed to shoot down the first of 7 aircraft on August 24, 1940, during the last days of the Battle of Britain. But during his time, he lost 5 of his own fighters in the process, once having to be fished out of the English Channel after being shot down by RAF ace Wing Commander Robert Stanford Tuck. His actions once also cost the life of his section leader, Adolf Buell, whom he left unprotected. He also had many girlfriends and was often late for morning roll call, and when he did arrive, he was often drunk. He even borrowed Ihlefeld's car once without asking. Ihlefeld had finally had enough and sent him packing to JG-52, where he landed on Ihlefeld's old friend, 1st Lieutenant, later Colonel, Johannes Steinhoff, who also had problems with Marseille, to include drunkenness, stealing Steinhoff's car more than once, returning with partially clad women, one visit by a Gestapo major who was looking for a Luftwaffe man fitting Marseille's description, after he saw him jump out of his daughter's bedroom window. He had also stolen an expensive bottle of French brandy. Steinhoff knew that he had to get rid of Marseille for his own good, as stated by future great aces Walter Krupinski, Gunther Rahl, and Dietrich Rabeck, who had their own experiences with the man called the Bohemian Bandit. Marseille, who had earned the Iron Cross second and first class in Holland and France, ended up in Austria, assigned to JG-27, being reformed and deployed to the Balkans. Marseille joined the unit in Bucharest, Romania on February 2, 1941. The unit was broken up by Gruppe. Some went to Bulgaria and others prepared to go to Africa. The first Gruppe arrived in Ain el-Ghazala as the advance party, while the others flew missions over Greece and Yugoslavia until early June. After a short time in Russia supporting Operation Barbarossa, the unit as a whole was sent piecemeal into North Africa. By December 1941, the entire Geschwader was in Libya. Marseille did not start out making a good impression. He ran out of fuel ferrying his Bf-109E4 to their new base and had to slide into the desert. Getting a car and driver from an Army colonel, he arrived, minus his fighter, which was later recovered. Marseille met the men whom he would serve with and ultimately tell his story. Some of them became high-scoring aces and outstanding leaders themselves, such as Gustav Rudel, Ludwig Franziskett, Eduard Neumann, Hans-Ernst Stahlschmidt, Ernst Bergen, and many others. Slow to start, Marseille began racking up victories steadily, but also being shot down on a few occasions. The Commodore of JG-27, Major Bernard Boldinga, himself a Spanish Civil War veteran and no-nonsense man, was wanting to get rid of him. But the executive officer, Captain, later Colonel, Eduard Neumann, saw something special in Marseille and convinced Boldinga to let him take charge of the young maverick. September 14, 1941 saw Marseille score his 18th victory, but he then started a ritual that would become the bane of Berlin and cement his legend with his enemies. Marseille shot down South African Hurricane pilot Patrick Byers of No. 451 Squadron, who was flying photo reconnaissance for No. 250 Squadron at the time. Byers' fighter became a flaming torch and he bailed out but was badly burned over 70% of his body. Marseille, Schroer, and Franziskett drove out to where his Hurricane crashed and recovered Byers, still strapped in his parachute. They took him back to their base and Marseille stayed with him for 3 days. They became friends and talked about getting together after the war. Byers forgave Marseille, and the German promised to check in on him. Marseille even filled out his Geneva Convention prisoner of war data card for him. After Byers was transferred to the hospital in Derna, Marseille took off and wrote a note, which he dropped on No. 250 Sudan Squadron's airfield, telling them about their friend Byers. Pilots Jeffrey Morley Mower and squadron leader Michael Judd witnessed the event and would later come to know who that German was. 2 weeks later, Marseille was informed that Byers had died in the hospital. Shattered by the news, he fell into a deep depression and flew another mission and dropped another note, telling the Allied pilots that Byers had died, and with regrets. This last flight did not go unnoticed in Berlin, and the Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, issued a direct order that Marseille was to never do that again. Marseille also violated some cardinal rules of combat. He devised his own methods of destroying a Luftberry circle, a defensive formation used by many Allied pilots. The Germans called the formation the Idiot Snake, where all the fighters would fly in a large circle, a wagon wheel, each pilot covering the man to his front, as well as another who covered his back. Whether Hurricanes or P-40s, it did not matter to Marseille. Every Allied pilot knew that a 109 could not turn inside a Hurricane, at least that's what they were told. That was until Marseille came into the picture. Finally, the order was issued to abandon the Luftberry due to the damage Marseille had been inflicting. Marseille fell ill with malaria and dysentery and, along with Franziskett, who had been wounded, was sent to Athens for medical treatment on December 27, 1941. While there, he received the telegram that his sister had been murdered in Vienna. While on leave, he went to see the families of his old friends, some of whom were Jewish. He found that they had all been deported, but to where no one knew or was not saying. When he returned from medical leave, he was a different man. After several months of combat, Marseille had scored enough victories to be awarded the German Cross in Gold by Neumann and the Knight's Cross by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who reminded him of the standing order from Goering about those flights. Well, Marseille ignored the warning when he later shot down Graham George Buckland, his 65th victory, and upon finding his body, Marseille took all of his personal effects, wrote a note, and repeated the same stunt. By this time, the Allied pilots knew who he was by name, and Judd had a white flag waved telling Marseille he was safe. They knew he had a message. They all knew who Yellow 14 was, and they respected him. Others who respected him were Stuka pilots of Stuka Geschwader 3 and their best flight leader, Captain Kurt Kuhlmeier. Kuhlmeier credited Marseille with personally saving over 24 of his men from being shot down and possibly killed on many occasions, himself included. Marseille also had a habit that Hellmuth hated. Berlin tolerated, and the men of JG-27 as well as their Allied enemies celebrated. He would never intentionally kill a pilot in combat. On at least 17 occasions, Marseille allowed an enemy pilot already defeated to either bail out safely or, if too wounded or did not have enough altitude, to crash land. Marseille would then write another note and drop it on the nearest Allied airfield so they could retrieve their comrade. But Marseille's disobeying the orders from Goering did not sit well with his squadron leader, First Lieutenant Gerhard Hellmuth, who threatened to court-martial Marseille many times. Only Neumann kept that from happening. The men asked him why he continued flying to enemy airfields to notify them of their pilots. According to Gustav Rudel, Marseille stated, "We only have to answer to God for our actions," whereas Rudel reminded him that there were some people in Berlin that may take exception to that comment. Marseille, who was called Jochen by all the men and Say by Neumann, had his treasured record album collection and phonograph. He would play the forbidden American jazz and big band music, and everyone let it go. Everyone except Gerhard Hellmuth, who found the music annoying and disruptive as he played his classical music on his phonograph. One evening, the two got into auditory combat, both men cranking up the volume, with Marseille finally taking his record player and wiring it into the camp speaker system. Waldinge and Neumann both had to intervene. After a mission, Hellmuth once again told Marseille he would recommend court-martial for violating his orders in combat. A death sentence offense, despite the Germans winning the battle that Marseille got them into. Marseille made it worse when he took off in his Bf-109 and strafed Hellmuth's tent, with his squadron leader in it. Marseille had become famous for shooting down up to 6 aircraft in a single combat mission, and his face adorned all the major magazines and newspapers in Germany and Italy, such as Der Spiegel, Der Adler, and Signal. But this event was beyond Waldinge and Neumann's control, but they sat on the paperwork as long as they could. Marseille was ordered to accompany General Erwin Rommel to Rome, where they were both received by Benito Mussolini and awarded the Italian Medal for Bravery in silver, as well as Marseille being notified that he was being awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross. On June 17, 1942, Marseille once again shot down his 96th to 101st victories. They were confirmed. The report went out immediately. Marseille was the top-scoring fighter pilot in the African theater. However, General of the fighters Adolf Galland, who knew Marseille and had visited the unit, had a problem. The court-martial paperwork landed on his desk. The list of charges was incredible, including attempted murder of a superior officer. The other package sitting next to it was the award of the Oak Leaves and Storage, the Knight's Cross. So he went to see Field Marshal Erhard Milch, the Luftwaffe's number 2, and even Milch said that it had to go to Goering to decide. Goering thought about it, and he forgave the charges and ordered Marseille to Germany to get his medals. He was considered too valuable to the propaganda ministry to throw in jail, let alone execute, and Goering wanted nothing that would bring a stain to the Luftwaffe, especially after he had lost favor with Hitler. Marseille arrived in Berlin, greeted by thousands of fans, as well as the paparazzi, the newspapers, magazines, and even a film reel crew. Then he traveled to Rastenburg, East Prussia, and met with Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann, Adolf Galland, and Hitler's personal pilot, Lieutenant General Hans Bauer, and they had a memorable lunch where he denigrated the Nazi Party and cracked a joke about Goering wearing nail polish. Later, back in Berlin, Marseille, being a known musician, was asked to give a piano recital at the home of Professor Dr. Willy Messerschmitt. The entire hierarchy of the Third Reich was in attendance. Joined by a violinist and cellist, Marseille played the approved classics until after almost an hour, he banged out a Scott Joplin ragtime tune. Hitler stood and cleared the room. Later that evening, at the lavish party thrown to honor all of the oak leaves and swords recipients from all branches of the military, Marseille had attended with his mother and fiancée, schoolteacher Hanneliese Cooper. Marseille overheard SS Lieutenant General Karl Wolff speaking to other senior SS officers. He knew at that time that Jews were being killed. Marseille was also taken on a propaganda tour, speaking to the Hitler Youth and various war manufacturing companies, and he test flew the new Bf-109G and was asked to write an evaluation report for Professor Messerschmitt's engineers. Before he returned to Africa, he had to once again see Mussolini to receive the Italian Medal for Bravery in Gold, and Hanneliese went with him. The next day, she took a train back home, and Marseille went absent without leave. He did not board his transport going back to Africa, and when it landed without him, a wide search was ordered. The fear was that he may have been killed by partisans, being famous, but he was still listed as absent without leave, an execution offense if it were changed to desertion. He was found in the Ardeatin area of Rome by a military police patrol and taken to Gestapo Chief Captain Herbert Kappler. What transpired between them is unknown, but Marseille caught the next Ju-52 out the next day and no charges were brought. Marseille had just escaped his 5th major court-martial and the 2nd where death by firing squad could have been a punishment. After 2 months away from the war, Marseille returned in August 1942, a very changed man yet again. This time, according to his friends, he was more serious, less jovial, and did not play his practical jokes on the men, which were legendary and would require another show. Marseille began telling the men what he overheard in Berlin, and what he knew to be true, as well as all the people who had been deported. The men were highly skeptical, even Schroer, but Schroer had heard something similar from his chief mechanic. He brought that man forward to tell the group what he had learned the year before. Suddenly, Marseille's story was considered more horrific than just a rumor. Marseille was also introduced to a South African soldier captured at Tobruk in June, a black corporal named Matthew Lutuku, whom the Germans called Matthias or Matthias. Marseille and Lutuku became fast friends, and Marseille's fluency in English eliminated the language barrier. Marseille was also learned in French, Latin, and Greek, and Lutuku's love of Jochim's music closed the deal. Matthias became cook and bartender for the unit, and Marseille made him his roommate in his tent. But Lutuku was more than just a friend. He probably saved Marseille's life on a few occasions. While Marseille was gone, the British Long-Range Desert Group commandos had been raiding German airfields, destroying aircraft. The airfields now around JG-27 were all laced with minefields, and Marseille had started sleepwalking and having nightmares. According to Gustav Rudel, Matthias kept him safe and followed him, keeping him out of the minefields. This arrangement of Marseille and Lutuku cohabitating raised quite a few eyebrows when high-ranking dignitaries visited, including Major General Hugo Dessler and Field Marshal Kesselring. When they inquired as to who's the Negro in your tent, Marseille simply said, "That is my friend Matthias. Where I go, he goes." Neumann said that he was questioned himself about the arrangement, and he explained that Lutuku was their prisoner and he was working for the unit. That settled the issue. But Marseille had been out of the action for a long time, but the Allies, reading all the German mail traffic, knew he was back. Geoffrey Morley Mower said, "He was back, and every time someone called out Yellow 14 or Marseille, every head turned to see where he was." Marseille had returned a much darker person from his 2 months in Germany. But it did not take him long to reestablish himself, and the enemy took notice on September 1st, 1942, when he shot down 17 enemies in 3 sorties that day. The next day, he received congratulations from Galland, Rommel, and Kesselring, and he was told Hitler wanted him back in Germany to award him the diamonds to the Knight's Cross. But Marseille, who had always chased medals and fame, seemed uninterested. It seemed that only the cheerful nature of Matthias could make him smile, and this was especially true after 2 of his best friends were killed, Gunther Steinhausen and Hans Arnold Stahlschmidt, both in the same week and killed by Canadian P-40 ace James Stocky Edwards. The unit had received a few of the new G-model Messerschmitts as they were rotating the older F models. Marseille had flown the G2, but he did not like it as much as his Franz, due to the roll and climb rate, which was a much lighter aircraft. However, Kesselring arrived on September 26, 1942, and he brought a war correspondent camera crew from the Ministry of Propaganda. They were to cover Marseille for a couple of weeks for the newsreels back home. During this visit, he saw that Marseille was not flying the new fighter as he returned from a successful mission, having shot down 7 aircraft that day. This Bf-109 G2 was one that Willy Messerschmitt and Goering had both personally delivered to him, so he told Neumann that Marseille will fly the new fighter. Neumann finally put his foot down with Marseille. It's an order. Marseille had just flown his last mission in his favorite F model. On September 30th, 1942, Hans-Joachim Marseille took off on his last mission, an uneventful escort for Kohlmei's Stukas. On the return, his engine began smoking and the cockpit was filled. Marseille radioed his condition as his wingmen who were watching the event flew beside him. Marseille held on until he was over German lines, inverted his fighter, dumped the canopy and pushed out. But as his fighter nosed down at high speed, he struck the tail and his parachute never opened. His fellow pilots saw what happened and shrieked in horror as Neumann was listening in his wagon command post. The Star of Africa was dead. The Allies knew he was dead the next day, and on October 3rd his funeral was held, attended by Kesselring, all the men of JG-27, and Italian pilots to honor him. Kesselring and Neumann gave eulogies. Later that afternoon, an unknown P-40 pilot flew over Neumann's airfield and dropped a note offering condolences for the loss of a chivalrous and gallant enemy. Of greater interest, such was the respect held for Marseille among his enemies, the major Allied newspapers in Britain, Australia, South Africa, the United States, and Australia ran his obituary. It is often said that what a warrior's friends say about him is important, but what his enemies have to say speaks volumes. Even the men he shot down, some who became POWs and others in hospitals wounded by him, felt a sense of sadness at the German that they tried to kill, but who had spared their lives. In my book, The Star of Africa, The Story of Hans Marseille, I chronicled his life as told by those who knew him, the men I was fortunate enough to have interviewed and even become friends with. The second revised and much expanded edition is forthcoming, with a lot more information, especially interviews with Germans and Allied pilots alike, that will provide a much better picture of an amazing fighter pilot and unique human being. Marseille was a man who dealt with the darkness of his business, as he also handled the great tragedies in his life that would have broken lesser men. His sense of honor and fair play in combat was challenged by what he'd learned regarding the evil that his nation was doing. He openly defied Goering, Hitler, Goebbels, field marshals, and generals. He womanized, he broke the rules, wrote his own, evading a series of disciplinary actions that should have ended his career, if not seen him shot. Such was the legend of the Star of Africa, who finished the war with 158 confirmed aerial victories. Thanks for watching today's episode of Forgotten History. If you like this episode, please consider becoming a channel member or joining our Patreon page. This would help us offset the ever-increasing cost of production. As always, please like, share, and comment. And if you have any show ideas, please contact us, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.